In the midst of a cold and foggy January night in 1931, the Duke of Windsor, formerly known as King Edward VIII before his historic abdication, vividly remembers the moment he first crossed paths with the Duchess Wallis Simpson. It was at a friend's house in Melton Mowbray, and little did he know that this encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to him renouncing the throne for love. Edward was quick to recount his initial impressions of Wallis. Her vivacity, wit, and unapologetic honesty struck a chord with him. In a world where discretion and politeness were the norm, her frankness stood out, earning her his admiration. These revelations and confessions were shared with an eminent American journalist named Charles Murphy, who convinced Edward to break his more than a decade-long silence and tell his side of the abdication story. This series of articles in Life magazine and the subsequent book marked a turning point in the Duke's life. From July 1947 to January 1951, Edward and Murphy spent countless hours together, often in the enchanting backdrop of the Windsor's Château de la Croix on the French Riviera. Murphy soon realized that the former monarch needed to cultivate a work ethic and refine his recollection skills. Edward's perspective on his life experiences was initially lacking depth, with a pervasive sense of grievance clouding his narrative. Murphy, adopting an approach akin to a patient teacher, guided Edward by suggesting topics for discussion and inviting him to share his thoughts. Edward began by expressing himself through spoken monologues, which were recorded in shorthand by a secretary. As time passed, he transitioned to writing down his recollections at length. The treasure trove of Murphy's papers, including Edward's own handwritten drafts on yellow legal pads, was eventually discovered at Boston University, unveiling what could be deemed the lost memoir of Edward VIII. This authentic and unheard voice provides new insights into why he chose to abdicate the throne for the woman he loved, Wallis Simpson. It is Edward's personal account of his life, seen through his eyes, lived by his own recollections. This narrative doesn't shy away from Edward's imperfections, weaknesses, and naivety, yet it also showcases his intelligence, loyalty, love, and determination. For the first time, it presents Edward's story in his own words. Despite Edward's claims of immediate attraction to Wallis, the details of their first meeting remain a subject of debate. Wallis, in her recollection to Murphy, recalled that Edward barely spoke to her during their initial encounter in Melton Mowbray. However, when they met again at a reception 2 months later, she overheard him asking if he had met her before. Wallis felt that he didn't pay her much attention. Edward, overhearing the conversation, disputed her account. Regardless of the discrepancies in their recollections, it was clear that Edward was eager to break free from the constraints of court life and sought Wallis's company at every opportunity. He was a bachelor, often alone and fatigued. Wallis and her husband, Ernest, had an apartment in Marylebone, where they served excellent food and hosted lively, witty, and intelligent conversations among their circle of friends. One of those friends was Bernard Ricketson-Hatt, the editor-in-chief of Reader's News, who found Wallis attractive, smart, and an extremely capable hostess. Wallis effortlessly transplanted the glamorous lifestyle of New York's Park Avenue to central London. The apartment was often adorned with flowers from Fort Belvedere, Edward's residence in Windsor Great Park, and Wallis wore precious jewels he had gifted her. Wallis succinctly explained Edward's increasing presence in her life by saying, "His days at court are filled with stuffed shirts. He comes here to be amused." According to Ricketson-Hatt, Wallis's husband, Ernest, understood the situation, but as a loyal Englishman, hesitated to make it an issue. Edward quickly became infatuated with Wallis. He confided in Murphy, expressing how she had awakened something creative within him, introducing elements into his life that he had never experienced before, such as curiosity, independence, impudence, questioning, and warmth. He felt like he was seeing things in a new light. He recounted his love for the Duchess of Windsor, which had blossomed 2 years prior to his abdication. This love was not born out of a casual encounter. He was at an age where frivolous affairs were no longer of interest to him. Edward admitted to making numerous mistakes in his younger days, but he knew he was falling in love with a woman who was already married to another man. Despite this, he couldn't control his emotions, as love has a way of sneaking into one's heart. With a precise and bullet-pointed description, titled by Murphy as HRH Description of Duchess, Edward listed Wallis's defining characteristics on Waldorf Astoria memo paper. She was described as very proud, independent, demanding of high standards of conduct, with an inflexible code of behavior, strict, exacting, elusive, chic, having a preference for the best, very sensitive, easily hurt, dignified, and a perfectionist who often wore herself out. One major attraction for Edward was the fact that Wallis was American. His visit to the United States had a profound impact on him. He mentioned that among the English aristocracy, there was a tendency to look down on Americans as brash newcomers. However, his visit to the U.S. revealed a different perspective, where people lived more freely and were unafraid to speak their minds to him, despite his royal status. Edward's journey to becoming the Prince of Wales had started at a young age when he was created Prince of Wales on his 16th birthday, just 7 weeks after his father became king. Over the next 26 years, he had worked tirelessly to create a modern version of this ancient office. He didn't see his role as a mere reproduction of his grandfather's traditional image, but rather as a spokesman for the rising generation, one that was more restless and iconoclastic. However, his desire to reform the monarchy clashed with his father's insistence on maintaining tradition. George B. advised Edward to remember his position and who he was, which left Edward questioning his own identity and qualifications. He realized that he was not inherently superior to others and that his royal role was chosen for him, making him appear even more different from ordinary people. He decided to maintain formality when required but sought informality in his personal life to align with his preferences and inclinations. As Edward grew disenchanted with the remote and aloof nature of his royal duties, Wallis became increasingly essential to him. In his eyes, she represented the freedom he craved in his life. The choice before him became agonizing. He had a duty to his inheritance, but he also had an overpowering desire to marry the woman he loved and make a life with her. Love was something he couldn't live without, and without it, his service to the state would seem empty. Upon the death of his father in January 1936, Edward ascended to the throne. At the state funeral, amidst the solemn procession, he had a fleeting moment when he caught sight of Wallis in a building's second-floor window. This brief glance meant the world to him, as Wallis had held a dominant role in his life since early 1934. By the time of his coronation, her marriage to Ernest Simpson had effectively ended, and rumors swirled about her relationship with the king. Edward was determined to marry Wallis and make her his queen while being crowned together. He had a deep aversion to Buckingham Palace and the trappings of royal life, but he also harbored a longing to be king. At the outset, abdication was not on his mind. He had accepted the throne with the hope of marrying Wallis, ensuring that the divorce and all preparations were in place for their marriage before the coronation. Edward confided in Murphy, expressing his deep desire for a private life and an independent existence, distinct from his royal duties. He believed in the importance of modernizing the monarchy and allowing the king the freedom to choose his spouse. His view clashed with the conventional notion that a monarch should conceal personal feelings in service of their royal obligations. For Edward, being king was a career, and he aimed to keep his public and private lives separate, a division he had successfully maintained during his time as Prince of Wales. Shortly after his father's death, he declared to his advisor, Walter Monckton, his determination to have a private life of his own and not be a prisoner of the past. However, his father's private secretary, Sir Clive Wagram, disagreed with him, asserting that the king had no private life. Despite warnings from advisors like Wagram, Edward chose to disregard their counsel and remain suspicious of courtiers' advice. This attitude would eventually lead to a clash with the British establishment, ultimately resulting in his abdication. Notably, Queen Mary, his mother, never mentioned Wallis Simpson, despite being aware of his previous flirtations. Edward believed that she either thought he would remain a bachelor or hoped that becoming king would sober him up. Her silence on the matter, combined with her strong opposition to divorce, indicated her disapproval of his relationship. Edward's reluctance to marry bothered his mother, and on his 30th birthday in 1924, She tentatively raised the subject, but he evaded it, claiming he had not yet found someone he loved and refusing to enter into a marriage of convenience. In an essay titled Family, Edward expressed his abhorrence of arranged marriages and the lack of guarantee for private happiness. He'd admired those who found greater happiness in divorce than those who lived in conventional but unhappy marriages. However, he acknowledged that royal marriages had no room for divorce, making it a lifelong commitment he couldn't accept. His fear of losing his freedom and abhorrence of arranged marriages were deeply ingrained in him, and he was determined to wait until he genuinely fell in love. In the summer of 1936, Wallis joined Edward at Balmoral, where they were in the company of other prominent figures. Her presence stirred controversy and overshadowed the aristocratic gathering. Even Winston Churchill, typically supportive of the king, disapproved of Mrs. Simpson's attendance at such an official event. Edward further fueled the controversy by insisting that she be named in the court circular as one of his guests. In an essay for Murphy, Edward defended his honesty, chivalry, and good manners, asserting that he could have concealed Wallis's presence to avoid gossip. But instead, he chose transparency, which offended certain quarters. He believed that duplicity and camouflage would have satisfied his hypocritical critics. The stay at Balmoral marked a critical moment in testing public and official opinion regarding Edward's relationship with Wallis, especially with the involvement of the British press. In hindsight, Edward admitted that he did not handle the situation well. He reflected on how the royal family had previously remained outside the intense scrutiny of the daily press during his childhood. The self-imposed censorship by the British press created a lightning burst of revelations when the facts were finally presented to the public. This sudden exposure resulted in scandal, political twists, and a stunned public, ultimately leading to a crisis. In the face of a looming crisis in 1936, King Edward VIII found himself at a crossroads, reflecting on his tumultuous decisions and their consequences. His relationship with Wallis Simpson, a soon-to-be divorcee, had triggered a series of events that would reshape the course of British history. Edward's journey into uncertainty began with Mrs. Simpson's divorce proceedings and the mounting speculations about his intentions towards her once she was free. Matters came to a head when he summoned the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, to convey his determination to marry the woman he loved. However, Edward quickly realized that he wouldn't receive the support he sought. Baldwin informed him that neither the cabinet nor the Dominions would back Wallis as queen. This left Edward with three options: give up the marriage, marry against his minister's advice, or abdicate. Baldwin hoped for the first option, but Edward found the idea of abandoning Wallis inconceivable. Thus he chose abdication. Seeking an alternative, he turned to his friend Duff Cooper, Secretary of State for War. Cooper advised Edward to avoid an immediate clash with Baldwin, suggesting that the marriage question could wait until Wallis's divorce was finalized. This approach, Cooper argued, would allow the public to become accustomed to Edward as king before addressing the marriage issue. However, Edward couldn't bring himself to follow Cooper's advice. He believed it involved subterfuge on a matter deeply rooted in British sentiment, particularly due to his dual role as a head of state and the head of the Church of England. As the head of state, he was technically free to marry whomever he wished. But as a head of the church, unwritten but powerful restraints limited his choices. Edward repeatedly emphasized his belief in the sacred nature of the coronation ceremony as the underlying reason for his reluctance to pursue Cooper's suggested subterfuge. Although not a religious man, he could never have gone through the coronation service with the secret intention of later marrying in a manner inconsistent with the doctrines he would have sworn to uphold. The ceremony also required him to take communion publicly, something Wallis, as a divorcee, was not allowed to do. The prospect of such hypocrisy did not sit well with him, as he declared, "I would not wish to take that which my wife was denied." In the end, Edward's unwavering commitment to his beliefs, both in terms of the sanctity of the coronation and his love for Wallis Simpson, led to his abdication. This pivotal decision forever altered the course of history, ultimately resulting in his departure from the throne. Dear friend, if you like everything new about the royal family and don't want to miss all the novelties, Subscribe to our channel and like it. By doing so, you take part in our development. We work for you.